Thanks very much, Alex. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Francesco Ventrella. Francesco is an art historian who is currently the Leverhulme Research Fellow at the School of History, Art History and Philosophy at the University of Sussex. His research explores the intersection between materiality and corporality in art writing. In the context of his fellowship at Sussex, he is working on a book tentatively entitled Connoissorial Intimacies, Modernity, Sexuality, and the Politics of Identification, which explores the impact of empathy theories and physiological aesthetics in art historiography at the fin de siècle and beyond. Today, Francesco will be talking about the Italian art critic and feminist Carla Lonzi, and in particular her book titled Autoritratto, that was first published in 1969 and comprises artist interviews that were originally recorded on audio tapes. So I'd like to invite Francesco to the stage now. Thank you.
Okay, how is everyone? I can't see you actually, but I have something for you. I have 150 copies of an excerpt from Artwriting. The meaning of Artwriting is self-portrait, so that you can get a sense of how, when you read this book, you can actually get a sense of what it sounds like. And you could kindly collaborate and pass it around. I leave one here. Should be enough for everyone. And thank you. I'm actually not quoting from this excerpt that I've given to you, but all of my quotes will be on a PowerPoint presentation. I'm a teacher in the end, so this is how I talk to people. So we stop this one. Yeah. Thank you. Before I start, this is a work that I've been doing, work on Carla Lonzi that I've been doing for quite a long time. It was actually my MA dissertation. And there are many women that I should acknowledge here. And for me, it is extremely important, since you don't have the footnotes of my paper, for me it's really important that I read their names. Katia Almerini, who has done research on women's independent art spaces in Rome. Paola Di Cori, who is a feminist historian. Laura Iamurri, who has the merit of having republished Autoritratto, the book, a few years ago, 3 years ago now. Griselda Pollock, who was my PhD supervisor, and I was so happy to introduce her to Carla Lonzi. Suzanne Santoro, who is an artist and a member of Rivolta Femminile, that was the feminist collective that Carla Lonzi was part of, and Giovanna Zapperi, who is doing what I think the most up-to-date research on Carla Lonzi, since she gained access to archival material that are in the hands of Carla Lonzi's son, and I thank her because she has shared some of this material with me. Also would like to join Alex in thanking everyone that has organized this great event today. And I would like to thank the organizers of the Rietveld Academie and the organizers of If I Can Dance for inviting me to become part of what I always thought it was a thrilling experiment in curatorial practice, If I Can Dance, which I follow since my times in the Netherlands. In fact, I feel that I'm coming back today to discuss what I've done since I first visited the Netherlands in 2006 as an exchange student at the master's program in comparative women's studies in Utrecht. That was a crucial experience for me I was coming as an art history postgraduate student from Rome, trying to enrich my feminist toolbox for a research on the relationship between feminist epistemologies and art historiography. Up until that point, Carla Lonzi's text on art had remained silent for me, or I should say unheard. I knew very well that Carla Lonzi had been a crucial figure in the development of one of the first feminist initiatives in Italy, Rivolta Femminile. I also knew that she used to be an art critic, but she had decided to quit her dealings with the art world once she got involved with feminism in 1970. However, it was only when I found a way of positioning myself as a man, a non-straight man, in a department of women's studies, that I eventually became able to read Autoritratto. This is the original cover of the 1969 edition of the book. Or I should say, to listen to that book. Let me explain what I mean. This book presents us with a complex interplay between reading and listening, and this is something that has been resonating in the room tonight, this question of, that we are reading writing, and we're trying to listen to the voices that are embodied in these texts. A reading and listening that can be analyzed on a number of levels. It is composed of the collation and transcription of interviews with 14 artists. And only one artist is a woman, Carla Cardi, the first one. And of course, the other voice of a woman is Carla Lonzi. And then you can probably read the name of the other artist. We don't need to mention men. These interviews were originally recorded on tape between 1965 and 1969. Some interviews would be published in the experimental literary magazine Marca Tre. And in 1968, Lonzi started editing the interviews in a book format, but also decided to interrupt the sequence between question and answer and between one interview and the other by reassembling arbitrarily the voices of the artists and her own voice alongside, which is quite important. This is how she describes the operation in the book Introduction, that happened to be actually the first line of the excerpt that I gave you earlier. This book is made up of passages freely edited together in such a way as to reproduce a form of banquet. Convivio is the word that she uses in Italian. One that is real for me, having lived it, even though it did not occur in a unity of time and place. End of quote. This montage maintains a sense of everyday speech throughout the pages of the book that is very much tangible when you read it. Hence, resonance here is inscribed both in the magnetic technology of the tape, actually the machine that she used in mid-1960s was called a magnetophone, and in the way in which Lonzi's cross-editing responds to certain semantic assonances among topics, words, very importantly, and sounds discussed with artists. It is very much a book to read aloud. Autoritratto also represents Lonzi's former resignation from what she called the phony profession of art criticism. And this gives the book another type of resonance. Indeed, this book resonates with the radical choice of the separatist politics of Rivolta Femminile, which some have argued are responsible for the mischance of a feminist art movement in Italy. Rivolta, in fact, opted out from getting involved with the cultural life marked by the heritage of the patriarchy. The modern definition of art was obviously one such heritage. As an effect of this radical choice, most of the artists and colleagues who had given the talented art critic their acclaim in the heyday of her career choose not to engage with the significance of a radical decision in 1969. They responded, perhaps too hastily, by pushing her decision to quit aside, relegating her to an allegedly segregated world of feminism. However, Carla Lonzi never stopped referring to creativity as a mode of self-emancipation. In some of the statements that she edited with Rivolta throughout the 1970s, references to art and creation are products that are progressively replaced by creativity and making as processes. And these are concepts that actually, these are words that actually reappear also in the writings of Rivolta that specifically deal with autocoscienza practices, which Alex has just introduced. Autoritratto 2 is an exploration of the processes of creativity in making. Indeed, using the magnetophone to let the artist speak was the first step towards the unmaking of a norm of art criticism that she associated with, I quote, the anxiety of the critic. So this interplay between interpretation, appropriation, spectacularization, and commodification that is intertwined with critical and curatorial practice as well. A number of artists and scholars have recently started to query her break and the meaning of her break, and also ask whether Lonzi's feminist stance against art is not only a biographical anecdote, but a radical question posed to the inauthenticity of art as a system perpetuated what she used to call the myth of male culture. Lonzi's autoritratto cannot be read as a prefiguration of her feminism. Nonetheless, she experienced feminism as a possibility of expression and as a consciousness which she was not able to find in the art system. Thus, in a diary written under the influence of autocoscienza practices within the groups, she writes that she could have never done feminism had she not gained a consciousness of the higher moment reached by man in the Hegelian sense through art, religion, and philosophy. Because, she writes, for me, feminism has to measure itself there in order to see the insufficiencies of the male patriarchal subject. End of quote. In using the expression doing feminism, in Italian fare il femminismo, born out of the colloquiality of Italian speech, Lonzi highlights how doing and making, both fare in Italian, cannot prescind from the undoing of those myths which maintain male culture and produce woman and femininity only as objects of the male gaze in the economy of spectatorship. Such an awareness would be structural to the debates internal to Rivolta Femminile, within which the figure of the artist prominently appears as a term of comparison with whom Rivolta's women found an affinity. Yet this was an affinity that Rivolta found only with those artists who went beyond, and I quote, the anxiety which anyone else has to appeal for the guarantee of culture, end of quote. But such artists were never identified by the groups, nor did the groups ever wish to identify with them. Eventually, some women artists within Rivolta, such as Carla herself and Simona Vella, felt that they had to opt out because their professional aspirations seemed no longer compatible with the radical views of the groups. The artist Suzanne Santoro, a member of Rivolta, as I said earlier, said that Lonzi did not want to be the Lucy Lippard of the situation. Even so, Lonzi's refusal to identify a feminist artistic identity does not rule out the possibility of envisaging art's feminist singularity. Yet after 40 years of feminism in the visual arts, in spite of Lonzi, I would say, her ideas may have gained a special resonance, particularly with regard to the way in which the so-called feminist art movement is currently being historicized or musealized as a global curatorial phenomenon. My response to Lonzi's it is an artwork. My response to Lonzi's work will not consider her art criticism merely as a document of her thinking before Rivolta Femminile, but as a demand for an encounter between art and feminism in the present. So when I started my research on this book, I realized that there was a fictional narrative of break and loss that was being presented in relation to the book itself. It was very hard to find in 2006 because it was printed in only a few copies in 1969. But autoritratto had always been there. It was never lost, repressed, or censored. The vocal specificity of this book announced that our relation to the past can be one of resonances rather than of breaks and generational gaps. Resonance proffers a temporality which is not chrononormative, for it challenges the narratives of progress, loss, and return by producing time as an embodied experience. In this paper, I will entertain an encounter between the politics of the voice and autoconscienza practices in order to develop a position that is responsive to the transhistorical resonances of separatism. This encounter is presented as a demand for difference and singularity, or uniqueness, which is the word that Cavallero prefers. A demand for difference and singularity rather than for identity and generalized inclusion. This is also a way for me to understand the space that is created by women's feminist politics. It is the story that I tell my students to explain why feminism is not the problem of women, but it is a demand about difference that is presented to everyone. And it is also the story that I tell myself on the importance of my own feminist standpoints when I speak of and with feminism, while avoiding to speak for women. I'm talking about women speaking, but in no way I consider my exploration of feminist vocalities as a model for men in feminism. I simply hope to contribute to an ongoing dialogue that fosters singularity over identification. There is a productive sense of vulnerability and undoing of the self here that I would like to explore, which I think can be transformative. I would like to start with a speech and with the fact that I am reading this speech as a problem. This is both a citation and a dedication in a way. The speaker is Carla. One says, "Power is interesting, but why does power not interest you and you insist on this point? Is that modesty? Mine is not modesty. Actually, I would like to make them understand that this attribution of modesty mortifies me. I hear people repeat that you are modest, you are simple, you are not. But it is not true. I'm not modest. How cannot they get it? At the same time, I must say that I have known power. Women know power, Carla." She's speaking to Carla Lonzi, of course. "Women know power on their shoulder. They know it. And it doesn't matter if, when I was a younger girl, I used to be a bully, one who had her own personality. I must well believe it. Otherwise, I would have achieved nothing, not even my work. How can one think that? But this doesn't mean that I have nothing to complain about. Even if my husband comes and says, well, look at that woman, she even dares saying that she's been subjected to the power of men. Sure, I have been. As upbringing, through society's order, which was established by them, by force. It might be a force dating back 1,000 years, who cares? Through domestication, through enslavement, through benumbing. Do you understand?" These words by artist Carla were transcribed from a tape in 1968. By the time of the publication of Artwriting, Accardi and Lonzi had already started to bring sexual difference in their critique of the art system. I wanted to read Accardi's words out loud to you because they resonate with the multiple meanings that can be assigned to voices, vocality, and speech. Accardi passed away 1 month ago, aged 89. Rereading her words for me is a way to make her voice present again, a form of commemoration, if you want. Although she eventually distanced herself from Rivolta Femminile, as I said earlier, she was and remains an important voice for the younger generation of artists and scholars who in Italy and elsewhere have started to investigate the problematic relationship between art making and feminism. The speech that I've just read to you also poses the problem of the relationship between voice and authority, and in particular, female authority. In classical rhetorics, speech, mythos, was not only something that women did not do. Speech was a skill that defined masculinity as a gender. Women do chit-chat, Men give speeches. In a recent article published, actually last week, on the London Review of Books, the classicist Mary Beard reminded readers that in ancient rhetoric, a low-pitched voice indicated mainly courage, while a high-pitched voice was and still is synonym with effeminacy, stupidity, and silliness. These things, of course, are not neurologically wired in our brains, but they belong to a cultural heritage which is literally enfleshed. In this speech, Carla suggests how we may learn to hear women's voices differently. The scenario proposed by Carla is full of condensation and triviality. She is defined by others as the epitome of modesty and simplicity. Instead, she does not define herself as that, but she claims to have known power. In letting Carla speech inhabit my own voice and haunt this space, I do not necessarily want to imply that her voice must be spectral, ephemeral, impermanent, or transient. The creatorly nature of the voice could suggest an essential quality somewhere between the non-human and phantomatic, as Alex discussed earlier, which may represent a limit to an analysis of the voice in a social, historical, and political perspective. I feel that the transience and ephemerality are too prone to the endorsement of a mythological voice. In the singular, a ghostly voice, the seductive voice of the revenant, or the femme fatale, the castrating screams of the harpies, or the voice of Circe, most famous of all, as Alex already said, the alluring vocalizations of the sirens tempting Ulysses. All these are powerful myths in a feminist genealogy of the female voice, however, and it is important that they are recathexed in a feminist attempt to rewrite patriarchal histories of anthropology, mythology, and teratology. Yet these are also myths that tie the power of the voice to the body of woman as object. In the Homeric song, the sirens, as we have heard, the sirens' alluring sounds exist only for the seduction of men. The voice of the sirens, Caballero explains, is phone without logos. It is primitive, irrational, monstrous, and deathly like the gaze of the Gorgon. Thus, the image of the creator of transience can answer only part of the questions posed by Carla Cardi's speech. The problem here is not how does a Cardi, as a woman, get her say, but as Mary Beard suggested, how can we make ourselves more aware about the processes and prejudices that make us not listen to her? This is a pivotal shift from a rhetoric of the silenced voice to the politics of the voice as a demand for acknowledgement, recognition, compassion, and difference. These questions make urgent the need to consider also other definitions of the voice, or I should say, voices. Voices can be conceptualized contingently in both political and aesthetic terms. Firstly, the concept of the voice is tinted with a number of political nuances which push the body in the middle of intersubjective experience. The voice is a political tool to make oneself heard. Having a voice refers to the agency of the subject to actually speak for him or herself. She has found the words to express what she feels, just as a way of saying. It is in this direction that the voice gained importance in the field of feminist psychoanalytical theory engaged with Lacanian psychoanalysis, for it provided theorists with a useful model to critique the stuff of the symbolic, that is, language and narrative. Lacanian theories have been extremely important to position the subject of the voice in relation to language and representation. And this can be considered as a political theory precisely because it presents the voice as a carrier of language, that is, which conveys representation. And representation is a word that in English has both this aesthetic meaning, make myself visible, but also political representation as representativeness. I've heard this, I've read this. So it exists as a word. But voices also exist, as I said, aesthetically. And what I mean by using this word, I mean sensorially. In the sense that also Jacques Rancière employs of aesthetic as about the senses, with his famous concept of the distribution of the sensible. And talking about voices in aesthetic terms also means in spite of language. Voices exist aesthetically as embodiment, as affect, as resonance, and vibration. And we heard actually an exploration of that this morning. Physiologically speaking, you are experiencing my voice through touch right now. It is the vibration of my larynx that, with the help of a technological device as this microphone, is reaching your eardrums and make them vibrate in response. This vocalic exchange is an aesthetic of quaking. But what happens when we use the voice to step outside language, the actual content of what I'm saying? Do we lose agency and representation when the voice and the body, so to speak, are no longer the carrier of speech? Does the voice lose meaning? To put it briefly, is subjectivity meaningless when it is left without words? Well, obviously not. Think of the critique posed by disability studies in relation to people with communication disorders, who can still find a voice to communicate their intentions and desires in spite of normative definitions of language. My interest in resonance stems from this attempt to focus on decoupling affect and representation rather than solely insist on language and representation. And this is also a way of tying together politics and aesthetics, getting together and this sensorial experience. However, we are very little accustomed to think of politics outside the boundaries of action and enforcement of the right thing to say. Indeed, we are not used to think politics beyond the political grammar of we, which is as much inclusive as exclusionary. I think of we as the vocalic inflection of modernist revolutions and as the medium for an alleged dialogic imagination. The political grammar of we, in fact, often entails that one speaks on the behalf of others. We is not based on self-determination and singularity, but on the assumption that singularity must be shaped after the we, after we say our freedom, our rights, our emancipation. The political grammar of we, Claire Hemmings explains, is problematic because, and I quote, it asserts a version of independence that privileges freedom from rather than attachment to context and other subjects, end of quote. I take this line when I talk about feminism, not because I want to exclude the possibility that there might be a collective political subject, a subject of action, but because I want to shift the emphasis on the importance, for me, to refrain from speaking for women, to avoid saying we. And I find that such withdrawal still has the agency to explore what Hemmings calls, and I quote, the subject of another political grammar, one of entanglement rather than freedom. This stress on attachment is particularly important for the politics of resonance, especially in its proximity with the realm of empathy. Resonance, empathy, and enthusiasm are three concepts that, in Western aesthetics, have been employed to explore attachment in the form of unwired transcorporeal connections. Like the voice, the empathetic encounter between subject and object takes place at a distance. Yet you can say that you are touched by an image, touched by the story that is told by you, to you by a person. You are touched by a present. While the aesthetics of empathy may lead us to invest in this fantasy of transmission and intersubjectivity, the politics of empathy instead depict a much more complicated scenario. Empathy is a useful concept, but it is also a means to incorporate difference. There is an assumption of reciprocity in the politics of empathy, which does not leave room to the singularity of experience. Think about the scene in which I empathize with you, and I say something like, I know exactly how you feel. Hopefully not bored. Empathy may thus produce a sentimental fantasy about the other that eradicates the space of singularity by endorsing the inequality between a subject who knows how you feel and an object whose singularity is no longer acknowledged. In the empathetic exchange, the capacity of the self to feel for someone else is constructed upon the objectification of the other's experience. Perhaps, as Claire Hemmings suggests, for an empathetic exchange to be good, we need to witness the divestiture of autonomy. We need to explore a form of empathy in which the exchange does not happen between subject and object, which is what happens in identification, but as an effect of a mutual practice of objectification. And this expression is tricky. So I can only emphasize here that there is a difference. This mutual practice can be intended as a form of attachment in which equality is granted upon shared vulnerability and fragilization rather than upon action and self-affirmation. Autoritratto resonates with this kind of fragility, which can be productive and transformative. So let me turn again to the book to see how these possibilities unravel. Lonzi explores the voice's ability to exceed the mere instrumentalization to the word. According to Cavarero, although the word is considered as its essential destination, the sphere of the voice is constitutively broader than that of speech. It exceeds it. Furthermore, and I quote, the voice appears this way not so much as the medium of communication and oral transmissions, but as the register of an economy of drives that is bound to the rhythms of the body in a way that destabilizes the rational register on which the system is built. End of quote. The pages of Autoritratto, as you can read in the excerpt, conserve in a condensed form a number of vocal traces. Moreover, through the technology of cross-editing, Lonzi is able to interrupt the linear and progressive narrative of the myth of male culture by rendering speech as rhythm, volume, and depth. And this is a passage that features on the very first page of the book. Accardi. I'm wholly so instinctive for now that if I lose my interest for a moment, my thought goes away. Fabbro. That I will tell you later, because that comes later. Lonzi. Ah, that, later. Then tell me in order of time. Fabbro. In order of time. Lonzi. In order of stimuli. The preservation of speech and a lot of ... dots that are transcribed by Lonzi in the text replicates the sonorous rhythm of interjections, onomatopoeia, ellipsis, which make the presence of the voice as embodied experience. The logic of resonance that is embodied in the process of recording the voices, transcribing and cross-editing becomes a virtual agent capable of undoing temporal models, rewriting the subject-object divide inscribed in the logic of spectatorship, and ultimately presenting us with a different concept of authorship. In approaching the conclusion of my paper, I want to insist on 3 passages which relate to the question of empathy as fragilization, which I proposed earlier. And these passages deal with the peculiar way in which Autoritratto undoes ideas about history and temporality, spectatorship and authorship. So I'll start with temporality. Carla Cardi and Carla Lonzi. And on the right-hand side is a work by Carla Cardi simply called Tent. The montage of Autoritratto shows some affinities with Carla Cardi's Tent, a work that she developed in the same years, so end of 1960s. This is a work that is done with a material that she found in a shoe shop in the 1960s, sorry, in a shoe factory in the 1960s, and it is called Psychofoil. It's a kind of vinyl, transparent vinyl. Paint is acrylic, and as you can see, the way in which it's painted is abstract, and there is a rhythm of gestures, which, of course, is about tempos and temporality. Both Autoritratto and the Tent are not mere objects, but should be understood as operations. They both have an inherent transparency, one which is material in Accardi's use of the Psychofoil, while the other one is technological in the use that Lonzi makes of direct recording. So it's a kind of transparency in that. Carla Cardi says that with the Tent, she wanted to experiment with the possibility of taking away. And I quote her words, "The tent does not come from an activity of mine. It is not even useful to me as a form of release. It is not a substitution. It is simply about making that gesture and finding the time to make it." End of quote. So the Tent does not really belong to Accardi as a creation, a word that is problematic for Carla Lonzi and the groups of Rivolta. It is not even the product of an inspiration nor intentionality. She says it's not even useful for me as a form of release. It does not stand for something else. She says it's not a substitution, which is something that makes you think about the fetish in the Freudian sense. So this passage, the way in which she explains this work, should be investigated in relation to the aesthetics of impoverishment explored in the book by both Lonzi and Accardi, but also by other artists involved in these interviews. Artists who in the same years were included, well actually in the very same year, 1969, were included by the art critic Germano Celent in the Arte Povera exhibition. However, my concern here is not to put the archive of art history straight. What I want to highlight is the way in which Accardi and Lonzi undermine the logic of authorship by presenting us with an impoverished gesture that is simply about making and, most importantly, as Accardi says, finding the time for making it. But what kind of time are we talking about? This is a quote from Autoritratto again, and it's Carla Lonzi speaking. To me personally, what is so attractive about recording? What attracts me is a very elementary thing, being allowed to pass from sounds to punctuation to script, finding a page which is not a page already written, but is a page that, well, like in those chemical processes where you have condensation. From a sound, you condense a sign, like a gas turning into liquid. I like this a lot. I don't know why. It's interesting that it's using this expression script. She's not talking about writing, and definitely no literature. By using the tape recorder as a mechanical trigger for writing or to produce a script, Lonzi resists the words which have been written to become history. Thus, the tape recorder becomes a means to activate a form of writing which is not aimed to supply pages which, she says, are already written. The gesture of transcription and cross-editing, instead, presents her with the possibility of a doubling, in which an encounter takes place with something unexpected, an assonance, a resonance, the new, the unexpected. This interrupts the progressive linearity of historical time that proffers a temporality that is not, as I said earlier, chrononormative. And let me now move on to the question of spectatorship. So this encounter with the unexpected and the new that is an effect of the redoubling that is offered by the technology of recording, something that again has been explored this morning and by Alex earlier, derives from the deconstruction of the divide between seeing and being seen that informs the gendered economy of spectatorship. One passage in her diary illuminates this process by making reference to autocoscienza practices, and I'm reading this passage here. In Autoritratto, by making the artists speak, I wanted to bring them back to themselves, making my presence operative in a different way. The fact that the artist expects a more and more adequate spectator reveals an impasse whenever consciousness is confined to only one row. For this reason, it is not right that we talk about creativity within feminism unless we understand that it is not a creativity of the patriarchal kind. The autoconscienza of one woman is incomplete if it stops at and is not confirmed in the autoconscienza of another woman. This passage signals a shift from identification to recognition, in which the gendered resonance of another woman can be associated with creativity, but only as long as it undermines the fixed gender divide of the patriarchal type, as she says, that constitutes the logic of seeing and being seen in art that is so familiar in art and visual culture. The comparison between women and spectators is ever present in Lonzi's diary and in the writings of Rivolta. Autoritratto too, as a convivial space, seems to allow the reader to no longer be left out as a spectator. And let me move now on to the question, final one, of authorship. Autoritratto, in this way, undoes the very logic of authorship that is requested of art criticism. But what is important here is that in spite of the fact that authorship is being jeopardized by the act of recording, transcription, and cross-editing, Lonzi does not lose her voice, which is something extremely important, as Alex highlighted earlier. We can still hear her voice among the voices of other artists. With the consciousness of a radical gesture, Lonzi asks, what remains now that I have lost this role in the art system? Have I become an artist? I can answer, I am no longer a stranger. If art is no longer among my resources as creation, it will be as creativity, as consciousness of art in the disposition towards the good, nella disposizione al bene, she writes. And it's so interesting, and it's so important, this passage for me, because there's a clear opposition between two different concepts of art. Art as the myth produced within the myth of male culture, and probably something that we can call art making, or Brakke Ettinger and Griselda Pollock calls it art working, which is more on the side of creativity rather than on the object, product-oriented side of creation, according to what Lonzi says. As a book, Autoritratto does nothing. It does not construct a chronological narrative of art criticism. It does not create a position for the reader as a spectator. It does not showcase any author. How can you say that Carla Lonzi is the author of this book? The book had no effect on the art system. Artists preferred to forget about it. It had no effect on the feminist movement either. Lonzi and Rivolta Femminile, as I said earlier, made many claims against the involvement with art and culture. Yet, the resonance of this book, embodied by the decision to transcribe rather than write these voices, this resonance functions almost as a withdrawal that demands for recognition. Carla Lonzi's transcriptions are mechanical and unintentional, but they may appear as an answer. Her repetitions are a reminder of the vocalic substance of the word. Yet, her voice is not her own. It is the effect of a doubling, which is something that Federica was exploring this morning. It has been estranged. It is mere acoustic substance that returns to her and returns her as object, but no longer the object of someone else's spectatorship, which is, I think, an important shift. This process of objectification and estrangement that Cavallero describes as well, so well, in relation to the myth of Eco and Narcissus, resonates with two projects in relation to which I would like to attempt some conclusions. The artist Chiara Fumai has developed a theatrical performance in which she recites passages of Carla Lonzi's book, Let's Spit on Hegel. This is a book that was written in early 1970s, 1971. And she was already part of the feminist collective Revolta. The emphasis of this performance, you just see three pictures documenting this performance, is embodied in the capacities of her voice, Chiara Fumai's voice, in the brusque shifts from an approachable to an angry tone. Chiara is able to explore ugly feelings such as anger, frustration and nostalgia, which some have argued were productive of the feminist euphoria in the 1970s. Another project organized by Lucia Farinati instead proposes a further impoverishment. She has organized a number of reading sessions of Autoritratto, and she has read with 14 other people the whole book. And I took part to one of these reading sessions in London. These sessions were recorded, and a few excerpts were broadcasted on an Italian digital radio. These encounters have spurred heated discussions among the readers, particularly in London. We were a group of Italian migrants, of Italian expats. And these individuals, very important, were not, these were individuals that were not all working in art and culture. It was an invitation that was presented through a network of friends. The project took Autoritratto back to its original state of banquet, but also created another temporal dimension in bringing the past back to life. Branding these projects as reenactments perhaps misses the point, I'm not sure. Neither of these practitioners creates anything. They are not the authors of the words, but this does not mean that they are left silent. In this paper, I wanted to suggest that there are ways of thinking representation in spite of a conception of language as that which speaks us. Affect, too, is a tool for representation. Emotions are a form of knowledge. Neither Chiara Fumai nor Lucia Farinati talk about making feminist art, though they do call themselves feminists, but this is not, they don't consider that as a brand for their own practice. These two projects are about feminist archives and memories, but they do not create alternative narratives of second wave feminism. What they do create is a space for storytelling. They do not appropriate the past as much as they are appropriated by it. They are undone by it, as both authors in the present and as spectators in a generational relation with the past. Cavallero writes that, and I quote, "What makes a narration a political act is not simply that this narration invokes the struggle of a collective subjectivity, but rather it makes clear the fragility of the unique." The concept of resonance is extremely elusive, but maybe one way to see how fragility can be more transformative than self-affirmation. My thoughts on Carla Lonzi's Autoritratto and the demands posed by her separatist stance are not intended to be an interpretation of the book, though it might sound like it, and are probably ahistorical as far as art history goes. However, I just wanted to experiment with a mode of writing, writing this paper that is confronted by such radical separatist demand. How do we talk about art without those myths that constitute art? Lonzi did not recognize feminist art, but by not doing that, she has left us with a creative demand to make art as a feminist practice. Thank you.